is organized by 3 institutions, or maybe schools, so to speak. It is the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, under which you have Ujama Center for Community Development and Research. And then you have the John Langalbalele Dube Chair, which is under the School of Education. And that is represented by my co-chairperson, Professor Lebo Muletsane. She's going to come forward when I call her to introduce the lecture to you. And then you've got the John Dube Institute, which is also based in the university. Do we have somebody from the J.L. Dube Institute? Is Tandy here? Is some of the people here? Well, let's hope they are on their way. Now, all these people that I've just mentioned have contributed to making this event a success. So they've contributed financially, they've participated in making sure that we make this. Now, the last person to introduce is J.L. Dube's grandson, umfowethu uZenzele Dube, okhona phakathi kwethu. Umafukuzela's grandson. Can you stand up, sir, so that they see you? I hand over to my colleague, Professor Muletsane, to come and give an overview of this lecture. Thank you.
As part of its research and community engagement project, among other activities, UKZN and its various entities focus on developing and disseminating knowledge through seminars and public lectures. The annual John Langalibalele Dube Memorial Lecture is the College of Humanities' contribution to this project. Beginning in 2003, the lecture, which was then hosted by the School of Religion on the Pietermaritzburg campus. With the establishment of the John Langalibalele Dube Chair in Rural Education in 2010, which I currently hold, the School of Education and the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics have collaborated in organizing and alternating the hosting of the lecture on the Pietermaritzburg campus and on the Edgewood campus in Pinetown. My colleagues and I are fortunate to have the support of the leadership of the college, the DVC and head of the College of Humanities, who since September 3 is now Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, and our 2 deans, Professor Sparat of the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, and Professor Thabo Msibi of the School of Education. Most importantly, over the years, we have had the support of the Dube family. Thank you very much. To give a glimpse into the history of the lecture, over the past 7 years, we have hosted the following people or guest speakers. In 2011, we hosted Professor Sherif Keita, whose lecture was titled The Cowboy Turned Renegade Missionary. That was John Langalibalele Dube. In 2012, we hosted the then Minister Paul Mashatile, whose lecture was titled John Dube's Challenge to the Humanities and Education in the 21st Century. 2013, we had Professor Vivio Mkhize, whose lecture was isiZulu language as an asset in the development of an African intellect in institutions of higher learning. 2014, Dr. Gcina Mhlophe spoke on writing women, gendering history. What would it mean to look at the 20th anniversary of South Africa's democracy from the perspective of Nokutela Dube? 2015, Dr. Duma Ndlovu of Mubango fame spoke on reconscientizing South African communities towards self-reliance and self-respect a ghost dance with John Langalibalele Dube and Stephen Bantu Biko. Then in 2016, Professor Ndongela Masilela spoke on the South African intellectual and political culture enabled by John Langalibalele Dube in founding Ilanga Natal newspaper in 1903. Last year, Dr. Maureen Tong spoke on the topic of violence on and through the land, violence on women's bodies, evoking John Langalibalele Dube's voice in contemporary debates. Tonight's lecture is titled, I'm gonna sit at the welcome table, the enduring power and promise of education as a public good. As Dr. Chadberry will outline for us, this year we locate the lecture within John Langalibalele Dube's contribution to education more broadly, and through the schools he and his family established. One of which is Ohlange High School, who we were hoping would be here tonight, as well as through his contribution as one of South Africa's early intellectuals. As we once again reflect on Dube's legacy, we would like to ponder the question, what can we learn from the intellectual and political culture enabled by John Langalibalele Dube in addressing the elusive equity and quality in our education system? The organizing committee, made up of myself, Sibusiso Masondo and Smanganiso Kumalo and Albert Bangirana from the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, Kumbulani Mngadi and Jabulo Manyoni from the University Language Planning and Development Office, and Xoli Swazulu from the Public Relations Office in the College of Humanities. We invite you to sit back and enjoy tonight's lecture. Thank you.
There's just no doubt that African music is beautiful, and of course it is quite high maintenance here. I'm now going to invite Professor Mletane to come forward to do the introduction of our speaker. And soon after that, she's just going to go ahead and the speaker will come forward and speak. I'm not going to stand. So soon after Professor Mletane has done that, Professor Mletane will come forward. Thank you.
I think we have a treat today. The brief bio is right behind your program. So I'm not going to read all of it for you. But I think it is important to draw your eyes to particular points in the brief bio. And I have to emphasize it is a brief bio. We could have gone for pages and pages and pages. So as you can see, Professor Chuck Berry is the Academic Vice President and Dean of the Faculty at the Ria College in Kentucky, USA. Most importantly for us, I think, and for this lecture today, he is also the good, is that how you say it, good professor of Appalachian Studies and professor of history at the same institution. But I would like to draw your eyes a little bit lower down to the number and titles of the publications that he has had over the years. Starting with his PhD thesis, and I know some of you and some of my colleagues just got their PhDs yesterday, so congratulations to my colleagues. His thesis was Social Highways, Southern White Migration to the Midwest, 1910 to 1990. I don't have to tell you how difficult that research would have been. I always marvel at people who do archival work, because I think it's one of the hardest kind of research that anyone can do. And continuing with that history, in 2015, publishing Studying Appalachian Studies, Making the Path by Walking. You can read the rest yourself, but just a glimpse into what the kind of work that he has done over the years. We welcome you to the podium, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Sane Bonani. I just have to say to the DUT students, do you know how impossibly difficult it is to follow you? Engia Japula, Ukuba, Nani Namshlanje. I have thought of South Africa as my second country since 1984, when I was an undergraduate and learned about apartheid. Then, as a PhD student, I learned much more about the history of South Africa, and especially the similarities with the US. I went on to teach my first university course several times, calling it Continental Drift, the history of race and racism in the US and South Africa. I've taken several groups of students and adults on study tours of Southern Africa, and recently, I sat at the feet of Alan Boesak as I welcomed he and Elna Boesak to my institution. And I'm proud that my son Nathaniel just returned from an internship for 3 months in Khayelitsha. My study of South Africa has taught me a great deal about how I must be as a human being for someone else to be free. I am honored to be here, and I am honored that you are here tonight. I want to thank Simangaliso Kumalo for his hospitality and his generosity. I have learned much from him, even if my pronunciation of Zulu does not show it. I've deepened my knowledge of John Dube and have grown in my esteem for him as part of preparing my remarks today. As I've learned more about John Dube and Nokutela Dube, I've continued to think especially about the connections between their lives, your lives, and mine. Here I would make 2 points. The first is that the past continues to be relevant in our lives today, helping us clarify our options in the present and future. This is the great moral imperative of history. Let me share with you the words of an American historian, Stephen Osmond, who wrote, quote, "If there is a mistake worse than believing that the present and the past are the same, it is thinking they are completely different. There may be worlds of difference between yesterday and today, but the past is not a different world. We are continuous. The past draws us to itself, and we learn from it precisely because we discover ourselves there under altered conditions," end quote. In this way, we are continuous with the vision and work of J.L. Dube today. We must all carry that vision and work forward. The second point is just how connected this world is. The late Robert F. Kennedy captured the similarities and connections between the U.S. and South Africa, ironically in 1966, in his Cape Town speech. He said, quote, "I came here because of my deep interest and affection for a land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British, and at last independent, a land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day, a land which defined itself on a hostile frontier, a land which has attained rich natural resources through the energetic application of modern technology, a land which once imported slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of that former bondage. I refer, of course, to the United States of America," end quote. Again, the racial histories of our countries are connected and overlap. Moreover, there are more connections. For example, Dube traveled to Oberlin College, the first college in the U.S. open to people of color in 1835 and to women in 1837. Oberlin trained one of Dube's most important mentors, William Wilcox. My institution, Berea College, had deep connections to Oberlin. Many of our 9 college presidents have had deep Oberlin connections. Berea was founded in 1855 in a state in which slavery was legal and became the first institution in the South that was coeducational and interracial, based on the Oberlin model, and is one of 8 institutions in the United States that require all students to work on campus. It has had deep connections to Tuskegee, the institution founded by Booker T. Washington, who was Dube's inspiration. In the book, The First President, Heather Hughes has revealed more connections. For example, when John Dube went to Adams College in the 1880s, she writes, quote, "He had probably never seen Durban before. The town was then a low-slung, leafy settlement laid out in an orderly grid that stretched northwards from the harbor. The streets were wide and unpaved. There would be complaints about the sand for years to come, and there was some suburban development creeping up the Berea," end quote. So there is a Berea in Durban, just as there is in Kentucky. Finally, I've learned that the Phelps-Stokes family contributed funds to Oshlange, and on my own campus, there is a chapel funded by Olivia Phelps-Stokes and built in part by our own students. It is indeed a small world full of similarity and connections. And of course, I cannot prove it, but I believe that the founder or one of the presidents of my institution might well have crossed paths with Dube on a fundraising trip in New York, or while Dube was studying in Oberlin. The importance of music in social justice movements in both our countries is also a similarity. And for that reason, I've titled my lecture, I'm going to sit at the welcome table, the enduring power and promise of education as a public good. This song originated as a slave spiritual, sung to relieve the pain and drudgery of a life in bondage, reminding the singer of other worldly rewards, that with struggle, persistence, and God's help, an enslaved person would one day have a place at the welcome table. In the 1960s in the US, the song was revived to provide empowerment amid lynchings, fire hoses powerful enough to peel bark off trees, but aimed at protesting civil rights, young people, and seething hatred uttered from white mouths. I want to play a version of this song for you tonight, sung by Hollis Wilk Watkins from the 1960s.
I'm gonna sit at the welcome table, oh Lordy. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days, hallelujah. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days, one of these days. I'm gonna be a registered voter, oh Lord. I'm gonna be a registered voter one of these days, hallelujah. I'm gonna be a registered voter. I'm gonna be a registered voter one of these days.
Nice, huh? This song, like all enduring anthems, can easily be modified for the particular cause, like, I'm gonna feast on milk and honey, or I'm gonna tell God how you treat me, or all God's children gonna sit together, or for the purposes of tonight's talk, I'm gonna get an education, or even better, I'm gonna learn at the welcome table. Let us sing that now together. I'm gonna learn at the welcome table. Please help me out, I'm recovering from a cold, and so, DUT singers, I need your help, okay? All right, ready? I'm gonna learn at the welcome table, oh Lord. I can't hear you. Gonna learn at the welcome table one of these days, hallelujah. I'm gonna learn at the welcome table. I'm gonna learn at the welcome table one of these days. I want to call your attention tonight to the timeless metaphor of the welcome table. Once the welcome table might have been in the slave owner's house. In South Africa, perhaps the welcome table was in the European homes dotting the Cape from earliest times, or in the white home in the 1950s. In the segregated American South, the welcome table was the drugstore lunch counter in the 1960s. Today, the hungry person living in an informal settlement in South Africa or a homeless person living on the streets in the US has a clear idea of what the welcome table is. That person is just not welcome. My point is that today, the welcome table should be the norm in all education policy. But the welcome table in tertiary education in this country and in mine is not very welcoming. So how does one learn at the welcome table? My first point tonight is that belonging and inclusion and climate matter. These concepts, to belong, to be included, to have a supportive learning environment are enormously important in fostering learning. Only quite recently have we in the United States begun to see how a sense of belonging in students often correlates with their success. My colleague, Bell Hooks, writes a great deal about belonging and inclusion. For example, she says, quote, "As a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence. Since the vast majority of students learn through conservative, traditional educational practices and concern themselves only with the presence of the professor, any radical pedagogy must insist that everyone's presence is acknowledged," end quote. And it can't just be stated, she says, but it must be demonstrated. The teacher, quote, "must genuinely value everyone's presence. There must be an ongoing recognition that everyone influences the classroom dynamic, that everyone contributes," end quote. And more recently, in a book called Belonging, she writes, "I believe that we can restore our hope in a world that transcends race by building communities where self-esteem comes not from feeling superior to any group, but from one's relationship to the land, to the people, and to the place," end quote. To belong, she argues, is to feel connected, balanced, self-restraint, generous, mutual, inclusive, and egalitarian. Put quite simply, no student can learn if she doesn't belong. Our work here is not just about access to education. It is also about access to the kind of education most transformative. One cannot feel a sense of belonging if one does not discover one's voice, one's past, and one's heritage in the curriculum studied. Those of us in the humanities in the United States have since the 1960s been resisting the Eurocentric canon, opening up humanistic disciplines to more inclusive perspectives, theories, sources, histories, writers, worldviews, heritages, and voices. I know South Africa is also engaged in decolonizing curricula, and such work is also an important part of belonging, inclusion, and climate. Here again, my institution has a connection. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history in the United States, and author of The Miseducation of the Negro, an enduring classic, was a 1903 graduate of Berea College, and he went on to earn graduate degrees from the University of Chicago, the Sorbonne, and Harvard. His words have been helpful worldwide at decolonizing learning and infusing Africanity and Africanization into a meaningful and transformative education for people of color, and indeed, for all people. One of his most famous quotes is, quote, "Race prejudice is merely the logical result of tradition, the inevitable outcome of thorough instruction to the effect that the Negro has never contributed anything to the progress of mankind," end quote. As Alan Busak has related to me, quote, "An education drenched," he says, "drenched in, dominated by, and directed by Eurocentric values, systems, and thoughts is in reality a miseducation of the Black student," end quote. So it is right and necessary, in my view, for at least equal, if not more, attention to African resources, African thinking, and African worldviews. This is precisely about feeling a sense of belonging at the learning table. I want to share two more points a bit more in depth with you tonight. The first is that education is liberation. This point is argued both by Carter G. Woodson and by Bell Hooks. And by the way, more connections. Bell once taught at Oberlin College and as a little girl, she attended the segregated Booker T. Washington School in her Kentucky hometown. Going to that segregated school in the apartheid South, she says, quote, "We learned early on that our devotion to learning, to a life of the mind, was a counter-hegemonic act, a fundamental way to resist every strategy of white racist colonization. Though they did not define or articulate these practices in theoretical terms," she continues, "my teachers were enacting a revolutionary pedagogy of resistance that was profoundly anti-colonial," end quote. When school segregation was slowly dismantled, she was sent to integrated schools, taught almost exclusively by whites. And, quote, "knowledge was suddenly about information only. It had no relation to how one lived, behaved. It was no longer connected to anti-racist struggle. We soon learned that obedience, not a zealous will to learn, was what was expected of us. Too much eagerness to learn could easily be seen as a threat to white authority," end quote. Where black teachers in segregated schools once believed that to educate black children was a political act, quote, "now," she writes, "we were mainly taught by white teachers whose lessons reinforced racist stereotypes. For black children, education was no longer about the practice of freedom," end quote. And realizing this, she lost her love of school. School was now merely reinforcing domination rather than fostering freedom. In the United States, many universities like mine are based on the liberal arts tradition, which seeks to educate a student with critical thinking, communication skills, and broad knowledge in preparation for a changing world. As one scholar explains, quote, "the liberal in liberal arts and liberal education does not stand in contrast to conservative. Rather, it derives from the Latin liberalis, associated with the meaning of freedom. Liberal, not as opposed to conservative, but as free, in contrast to imprisoned, subjugated, or incarcerated." And she continues, quote, "Arts comes from the Latin root ars, art, meaning art or skill," end quote. And isn't the notion of liberation why J.L. Dube might have been called to found Oshlange? Indeed it is, for he wrote, quote, "In America, I have found the key to the liberation of my people, which is education. I have brought it back with me," end quote. Professor Simangaliso Kumalo reminds us that, quote, "as an educationist, therefore, his approach to education was one that built a culture of independence and dignity in the learners," end quote. And let me remind you how insightful Dube was, because a century later, we are still imploring the values that he articulated and modeled in education. John Dube, I believe, had the welcome table in mind. And isn't this what Nelson Mandela was doing when he went to the school to cast his vote in 1994? In the words of Professor Kumalo, quote, "For Mandela, this was no ordinary day, as it was the day of the first democratic elections. Oshlange Institute, where the chapel was located, was also no ordinary South African township school, for it was built by Dube, making it one of the first schools to be built and managed by Africans at a time when conventional thinking did not believe that black people could develop and maintain institutions of their own," end quote. I believe that John Dube worked tirelessly to found and sustain Oshlange because of liberation. He wrote, quote, "I long for the day when the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings, and when on every hilltop shall be a schoolhouse and a church. Then shall we say to Africa, arise and shine, for thy light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon thee." End quote. Education's liberatory powers are why no slave owner in the American South allowed one's enslaved people to learn to read. Knowledge was and remains power. Bell Hook's words written over recent decades could have been John Dube's words written a century ago. She writes, quote, "To educate as the practice of freedom is a way of teaching that anyone can learn. That learning process comes easiest to those of us who teach, who also believe that there is an aspect of our vocation that is sacred. Sacred. Who believe that our work is not merely to share information, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin," end quote. Elsewhere she writes, quote, "Learning is a place where paradise can be created. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. This is education as the practice of freedom," end quote. But again, one cannot be free when one is denied a seat at the learning table. My second point tonight is that freedom comes through education, but so does economic opportunity. No other force in society moves economic and social mobility like education. And yet, perhaps because of this fact, access to affordable education, particularly university education, remains inequitable. It's certainly highly unequal in the United States and here in South Africa. Perhaps that is because those who oversee the welcome table fear that inviting more to the table will result in having to share resources with more people, making those resources scarcer. I'm convinced, however, that making room for more at the welcome table doesn't divide up existing resources. It creates more resources. Metaphorically, we get more food by inviting more to the table, not less. When you make room for more students at the learning table, you generate more economic output for everyone. So how can powerful humans be so selfish? In both South Africa and the United States, as well as in countries around the world, education is conceived as a right of all human beings. In fact, in the last few years, given the increases in costs in higher education in our two countries, as well as elsewhere, free higher education is now articulated as a human right. Free higher education was a plank of the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign in 2016, and it certainly has been a core issue in the Fees Must Fall campaign here. Interestingly, though, the United Nations in 1966 adopted a covenant that declared, quote, "Higher education shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education." End quote. Although President Jimmy Carter signed the covenant in 1977 in the U.S., it has never been ratified by the United States, and it was only signed by South Africa in 1994 and ratified in 2015. It is my view and your great Constitution's view in Section 29 that higher education is in fact a basic and essential human right. And furthermore, it is a moral imperative in any civilized society. In short, it is a public good. The European Student Union has written that, quote, education is a core institution of any society and one of the main pillars of a modern civilization. It plays a central role in social and economic development, democratic empowerment, and the advancement of the general well-being of societies. Open access to all levels of education is the cornerstone of a socially, culturally, and democratically inclusive society, and a prerequisite for individual and societal development and well-being, end quote. Increasingly, however, at least in my country, that notion of a public good is being challenged by those who see higher education as a personal investment, hence open to some who can afford the investment and not to others, similar to purchasing a commodity, such as buying a car or a home or even a ticket one purchases for a seat at the welcome table. In my view, this is a very ominous situation, and it portends a real challenge, not just to the higher education sector, but also to civil society. A U.S. report in 2015 stated, and I want to share this long quote with you, whether we believe that higher education is a civil right and an essential element of a full democratic society, or a fundamental requirement to enabling all to achieve the American dream, higher education opportunity and outcomes are highly inequitable across all family groups. Moreover, on many indicators, gaps are larger now than in the past. The disinvestment of state funds for public colleges and universities since the 1980s and the declining value of federal student grant aid have aided in the creation of a higher education system that is deeply unequal. Once known for wide accessibility to and excellence within its higher education system, the U.S. now has an educational system that sorts students in ways that have profound implications for their later life chances. More work is required to achieve the vision of ensuring all Americans have the opportunity to use their creative potential to realize the many benefits of higher education and advance the well-being and progress of the nation, end quote. As Frederick Douglass wrote, quote, to deny education to any people is one of the greatest crimes against human nature, end quote. And we are denying students a seat at the learning table because of socioeconomics. By only welcoming those at the learning table who have the ability to pay, it suggests that in fact our society does not believe higher education is a public good. Talent is universal in both the United States and South Africa, but opportunity is not. Again, I repeat, talent is universal, but opportunity is not. Our countries share the dubious distinction of some of the world's highest inequality. The Gini coefficient is the most commonly used measurement for inequality worldwide, and for South Africa, it is very high. But for my state of Kentucky, it is not far behind, ranking my state among the highest in inequality in the U.S. As a whole, U.S. income inequality is currently at its highest level since the government began tracking household income in 1967. The U.S. also has the greatest disparity among Western industrialized nations. One should not be surprised at inequitable access for tertiary education. Therefore, we must work to address the gaps in access to and graduation from university in both countries. Former President Jacob Zuma's announcement in December that the government would subsidize poor and working class students without loans is a right step. Given that a commission, though, found that there was no capacity to provide tertiary education free of fees, this will be an interesting issue to watch. I come from an institution that has academic and financial eligibility requirements. That means an applicant must demonstrate high academic promise, but that same applicant must also demonstrate an inability to pay for high-quality tertiary education. For example, if you have high entrance exam scores and come from a family in which your mother is a doctor and your father is a banker, my institution will not admit you because your family can afford other options for high-quality education. I am therefore very much in favor of free education for the poor and underserved, for they are exclusively whom my institution serves. We do not charge tuition, and students pay very little for housing and meals because their federal aid, freed from being applied to tuition costs, can be applied to housing and to meals. And furthermore, we don't just admit students, we hire every one of them, requiring every student to work at least 10 hours a week on campus. That work initiative, which began in the 1890s, was one thing that impressed Booker T. Washington about Berea College and so connects us to Dube today. We also pay students for that work, giving them annual earnings between $2,000 and $3,000. But we also give them experience for the world beyond Berea. We like to say that we provide our students the best education that money can't buy. That money can't buy. We consequently have the lowest debt of any graduates in the United States. I am less inclined for free education for all, given the gross inequality in general and access inequity in particular in my country. I worry about free-for-all schemes because it often becomes regressive. It is often those from advantaged families who access those schemes. If disadvantaged students do not feel welcome, they are less inclined to access free education, and the data in my country prove this. Remember that low-wealth students have challenges both in affordability and access. A free education offer tackles the affordability, but often has done little about access because students don't have money for housing or meals. In my country, the poor cannot pay for education, and the wealthy do not want to. We must therefore make tertiary education affordable and accessible, especially to those who can't pay, not those who don't want to pay. Berea's education is one of the head, heart, and hands, still as relevant today as in the 19th century, and still in keeping with Dube's vision. Our students are challenged through academics, the head, through learning about inclusive Christianity, the heart, and through the dignity of all human labor, mental as well as manual, the hands. Quote, "In all these directions," Dube wrote in 1900, "what the African person needs is a sound education and training, not only by the literary meaning, but of the mind, heart, and spirit, by a real education through the hand, the eye, and the brain. It is my conviction that success in politics, industry, and all forms of progress," Dube wrote, "lies in education. It is a real development of all the human facilities. That is the reason I have devoted my life," he wrote, "to this work," end quote. Let me also suggest that we need to think about being inclusive in all types of education. We need not invite only certain types of students or only certain types of studies at the welcome table. Our societies need skilled workers as those with advanced degrees. We need electricians and economists. We need plumbers and physicists. We need welders and writers. In my country, we have often struggled with this kind of awareness. A bachelor's degree has been far more valued and supported than a 2-year, more vocational degree or even an apprentice program. My college's founder recognized this, starting not only a college, but a secondary school, a college preparatory school, and more vocational programs in nursing, agriculture, education, and what once was called industrial arts. All students ought to be welcome at the table, regardless of their curricular plans and paths. And John Dube knew this, as Professor Kumalo notes, quote, "For Dube, industrial education was not a substitute for intellectual knowledge. The two had to go together, for they were both important if black people were to be fully independent." So the establishment of Oshlange was an act of protest by Dube against the government that controlled the kind of education that was offered to the African people, end quote. I want to address one final concern about higher education, at least in my country, and that is the increasing politicization of tertiary education from both sides of the political spectrum. Conservatives say that it indoctrinates rather than educates. Progressives say that it's much too expensive, much too elitist, much too removed from the real world, and much too inept at preparing students for work. The most damning charge is quality. Only 6% of graduates in the U.S. have had a long-term capstone project, an internship, and deep involvement in extracurricular activities and organizations. 6%. I'm shocked that only 14% of recent graduates nationwide have had at least one professor who made them excited about learning, a professor who cared about them as a person, and a mentor who encouraged goals and dreams. Just 14%. We must craft compelling rebuttals if we wish to have public investment and trust. We have to show that we are deeply engaged in and committed to the community beyond the campus boundaries. We need to message how we work to model a democratic learning and living community, one where engaged students have practiced learning from their mistakes so they can replicate this community out into the world. We must craft compelling messages based on our graduates' meaningful and purposeful lives. We must highlight our graduates' voices and those of our faculty and staff who are the agents of these transformations. And we must show that our students' learning prepares them to enter the world prepared to strengthen democracy and enhance the quality of life for all people in society. When we do, we strengthen the notion of education as a public good. Dube was a man of remarkable achievements. You know about these, but what he shares with the founder of my institution is the construction of an enduring vision. Our founder, as a young man, graduated from seminary and aspired after graduation to create the Gospels here on earth. When he looked around him, he decided that the best way to do that was to provide education to women as well as men, to black folk as well as white, expressly at the same school. And he took as his school's motto the verse from Acts chapter 17, God has made of one blood all peoples of the earth. A verse Dube refers to when he asks, quote, why then should there be any race feeling? Why should we not love one another and try to help each other? End quote. Oshlange's meaning, to bring all ethnic groups together, is similar to the notion that God has made of one blood all peoples of the earth. All this my institution's founder aspired to in a time and place in which it was legal and common for one human being to own another. Such a belief also put his life in danger. When he returned home to tell his father, a slave owner himself, about this vision, his father disinherited him, and he never spoke to his father again. During the course of building Berea College, he was run out of town and beaten many times. And yet, he, like Dube, persevered. In so doing, he created a prophetic vision, like Dube's, that is as relevant today as it was in 1855. Our founder, the Reverend John Fee, dreamed of a seat at the welcome table for black and white women and men, learning and living together, and most of all, being seen, which I've learned from Zulu speakers is an essential element of human freedom. I suspect he and Dube would have gotten on well. Dube worked tirelessly for a seat for Africans at the welcome table, at the learning table, and one day at the voting table. And today, I believe he might well be at the front lines, perhaps with Nokutela, with her beautiful voice, leading the chorus of the multitudes in singing, I'm going to sit at the welcome table. Think about it. Can you imagine that? Their voices, of course, are sadly silent today, but their vision lives on, and the best thing we in this great room can do is work to perpetuate that vision. I'd like to think that today Dube is smiling down upon us. So it is incumbent upon all of us who stand on both of their shoulders to ensure that we add our voices to today's chorus, ensuring that all those who have been denied a seat get one, ensuring the kind of empowerment that compels you to bring your own chair to the table just in case you're not offered a seat. The great Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman in the U.S. Congress, echoed this. Quote, if they don't give you a seat at the table, she said, bring a folding chair, end quote. Working so that more and more are given seats ensures that conversations are richer, learning is deeper, investment in the country is more equitable, and that the future is brighter. Do all you possibly can, and then some, to enlarge the welcome table. It was once enlarged for you. Having a seat at the table, after all, is only meaningful when one uses one's voice at that table, at that conversation. Such is the vision and the legacy of the man whose name is attached to this important lecture today. May it be so. Agube and Jalo. Bekuye and Tokoze and Kulu Ukuba Nani. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just give him another round of applause. This was a great lecture indeed. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Professor Carol Bertrams to give a brief response to this lecture, and then we'll move on. Welcome.
Thank you for this opportunity to respond to Prof. Chad Berry's thought-provoking lecture tonight. I'm not really the acting head of school just for these 2 hours. Prof. Thabo Msibi has asked me to stand in for him. Prof. Chad Berry has provided a really evocative metaphor and song of the welcoming table as a place where all students may come and learn. And I thought it was amazing that his college, Berea College, does not in fact charge tuition fees, which must be a very rare thing. In South Africa, we know that we've increased access to students to higher education and to vocational training colleges over the past 25 years through the NSFAS financial aid system. But we also know that this increase in access has not been accompanied by epistemological access or graduation success for all. The percentage of students who complete a bachelor's degree in the minimum time in South Africa is really small, and it's also highly differentiated by race. The percentage of white students, for example, who graduated within the regulation 3 years ranged between 43 and 52%, whereas for black students, it ranged between 11 and 13%. So black students represent 75% or 80% now of all enrolled students, but only 25% of these graduates finish within regulation time, and only 45% of those enrolled, no, actually 45% of those enrolled, in fact, drop out of the system and never complete at all. We know that this disparity is due to socioeconomic class, issues of cultural capital, and of course, a differentiated schooling system. We have a bimodal schooling system where 20% of schools produce results that are basically on par with an international average norm, if you take international test benchmarking. And 80% of schools in South Africa produce results that are way, way beneath these international norms. Recent data shows that 80% of South African school children in grade 6 cannot read for meaning. What this means is that 4 out of 5 children in a grade 6 class cannot make sense of a text. These reading gaps are seldom bridged throughout high school, and thus most South African children are still reading at a grade level way beneath their years. This obviously has huge implications for how they access learning at university. So we know while the NSFAS funding for students has increased exponentially, funding for South African universities as a whole has not, and student numbers have. So academic staff are now expected to teach larger and larger classes with less tutor support, which is obviously not an ideal situation. It seems ironic that at a time when we need a highly supportive higher education system, which will prepare students to be critical and engaged citizens, we in fact have a situation where academic staff are stretched thin, and they are burdened by the managerial discourse which focuses on counting workload hours and counting productivity units. This discourse cannot and does not measure how staff create a sense of belonging and inclusion in the classroom, of how they support and encourage and engage students in important debates and unsettling theories, and of the hours they spend in building the foundational skills that students didn't develop in high school. This managerial discourse cannot and does not wish to measure to what extent we are offering students an education of liberation, which provides intellectual and spiritual growth, a key idea raised by Prof. Berry. He also raises the issue of higher education as a public good. And we know that having a tertiary education in South Africa does indeed bring about better job opportunities, particularly for older graduates. It's interesting that the average unemployment rate in South Africa at the moment is about 26%. Recent stats, this is 2018, show that graduate unemployment for those who have just graduated is actually 33%. But once you get older, it's only 10%. So those who are aged between 25 and 35 who have tertiary education have an unemployment rate of only 10%. And as you get older, it's only 4%. So what this means is that it's becoming increasingly difficult for new graduates to find jobs, which is obviously linked to the lack of economic growth in South Africa, but it's also a global phenomenon. I think the issue of higher education as a public good has fallen off our agenda in recent times. It was key in the 90s, but I think it's been overtaken by fees must fall, student protests, and issues around funding, which have been so key. I think we need to go back to those debates to engage more robustly about what is the role and purpose of higher education in South Africa, and what intellectual role we think that graduates and academics can play in creating a more cohesive, generative and productive nation. But I thank Prof. Berry for raising these key issues in his lecture tonight and giving us a lot of food for thought. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Prof. Bertrams. Really, really thought-provoking, and you responded quite well to this wonderful paper. And now we're going to take just about 10 to 15 minutes to engage with Professor Berry here. My colleagues are going to be providing mics at the back there. So people who've got comments and questions are welcomed to raise them at this time. One I can see, we're going to take 3 at a time. So I've got 1 there. Any other? Going 2. Another? Okay, let's take these 2 for now, whilst others are going to be thinking. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Prof. Kumalo, the program director, and thank you so very much for the guest speaker. I think there is a comment that I just want to make, and then I will end with a question. The comment is just going to be, in the debate around decolonizing the curriculum, I think we need also to start asking questions, the origins of African universities. Why do we have them? What was the purpose for us to have those universities? Were they to respond to the need of the society or the need of the market? And also, we need also to check for some of us who are young lecturers and young academics to become. The old academics are not buying to the idea of decolonizing because they've started becoming corporate. They spend much more thinking of becoming directors of centers. They spend much more time focusing on CPUs. As a result, they don't want to teach. For them avoiding teaching, where are the young people going to get inspiration of knowledge production while they want to supervise without teaching? You end up having a class where us, who just have 1 semester with a PhD or a master's, teaching 700 students, while the old ones, they are spending much more time thinking how to become VCs, deans, director of many things. Do you have a comment? Do you have also that disease in your university? Because here it is a disease that is affecting the young ones.
Thank you. Let's have my brother there. He's having a question.
Thank you, Prof, for a very insightful lecture. My question, actually, it comes from a statement you made about how increasing access to education, rather than depleting resources, actually increases resources. I don't know if you remember making that comment. In our own context in South Africa, to make higher education free, beginning of this year, I think, the VAT was increased by 1%. So in a sense, we seem to be having the opposite of that effect. How can that mentality be broadcast, or how can the broader population of South Africa see value in increasing access to education?
I'm not a historian, but I think about I'm not a theologian rather, but I think about the loaves and fishes parable. I think there's some key message there. I live in Appalachia, which you may not know what that region is, but it is a historically underdeveloped region with incredibly low educational attainment, vast dependency on government aid programs. Some people have called it a colony within an empire. And because this educational attainment is so low, and it has been low for generations, we are perpetuating an underclass. And one of the reasons why my institution serves Berea students by reserving slots, where the Board of Trustees says that 60 to 70% of our students must come from that region, is precisely because it is undeveloped. And bringing those students to the learning table does enhance resources. Most of them are first-generation students. Many of them come from families that are struggling with opioid abuse, with incarceration, with chronic poverty. And they go on and graduate from a college with a 4-year degree. They get a job. They change not only their lives, they change their families' lives by sending money back home, and they change their future lives of children if they have them. So for me, the manifestation of how inviting more people to the table creates more resources, not makes them scarcer, is indicative of what I see in my own region. It's very powerful. And when you know when these students, where they've come from, when they arrive as first-year students, and you see them walk across this platform 4 years later with a bachelor's degree, you know how arduous that journey has been, but also how transformative it has been for them. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
There was this question that came from...
Oh, there must be something in the air, because we have that disease too. Maybe it's the water. As you were talking about faculty who are thinking about ways of getting out of teaching, one thing I struggle with is, what does a university do when a colleague is really burned out or disillusioned or beaten down, and we know is ineffective in the classroom and would rather be almost anywhere else on earth but there? What do we do? And I think institutions, organizational cultures have obligations to continue to invest in and try to develop and work with that person to turn that feeling around. Because I think great harm can be done when someone reaches that point and is in a classroom being ineffective. And that's something that I think about as the dean of the faculty at my own institution. Yours is a good question, a good comment. I'd say right now that since your comment hit a bit home to me as an administrator, I say to my colleagues and to students right now that the best thing about my position is that I don't teach. The worst thing about my position is that I don't teach, because I've had some really wonderful experiences being with KwaZulu-Natal students this week, and they've inspired me, they've taught me, and I will go home enriched as a result. And I miss that in my own work right now.
Thank you. Any other question? 1, 2. Who else? Okay, let's take the, yeah, 3. Okay, start there. Olani, and then another one here. We start there. The first hand was from that side. And let's honor that.
This person?
The first hand came from, yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I just want to find out, in terms of the formation that we spoke about Triple H, the head, the heart, and the hands. What is the value of that in terms of the academic space? Because recently we've received the stats that many of our African brothers and sisters seemingly do not finish up their education. Mm-hmm. Simply because in the institution in which they are being educated, it is only the head that is dealt with. Matters of the heart and the hands are not dealt with, which means that they become empty vessels. Mm-hmm. They know how to actually take knowledge from those who's giving their knowledge. Whether that knowledge is turned into insight or not, it's another matter altogether. So how important is formation?
I'm so
in
glad
terms of the education system?
you asked that question. When Carol was talking, I thought about those statistics in the graduation gap. And at my institution, we've been using another metaphor in order to make sense and meaning of our work. And we use the metaphor of a bridge. So we work very hard to help students bridge into the institution from high school with special programs to ensure a seamless transition. We work very hard in the bridge through, meaning getting students out, in our case 4 years, not 3, because if a student has to stay for 5, then that student ends up taking another seat from another student. And so we work hard to think about bridging through the institution, but we work especially hard in the last 8 years when I've been dean at what we call the bridge out. And that is helping our students design and facilitate the construction, metaphorically, of the bridge out from Berea into the real world. When I was an undergraduate student, I went to a wealthy institution, and I hadn't a clue what I wanted to do my senior year. But my friend, late one night in the library, and I were talking, and she said, "Oh, Chad, why don't you just call my dad? You know he'll give you a job." And he was the CEO of Coca-Cola. Our students at Berea, because all of them are disadvantaged, do not have those connections. So we've had to fundraise money for proper suits, for interviews, for graduate school visits, for test preps, for law school exam or medical school exams, or to give students money so that they can dream their internship dream and go and fulfill it without being encumbered by no funds to live or to sleep or to eat safely. So it's that bridge out that we've been concentrating on deeply in the last few years. And it's in part because of the difficulty that students, I think, increasingly have today in getting a foot inside a door of a career. And if we already have people in the United States who are doubtful of the value of a college degree, I think it's incumbent upon all of us in universities to ensure that we do all we can to get students out, either in graduate school, in a job, and empowered to articulate the value of their 4 years of learning. So I think yours is a great question.
Yes, we've got the last two. One, Olani there at the back, Dr. Saguba, and then there's somebody else here, my sister there. Yeah, okay.
Good evening. Thank you, Prof. I want to go back to your metaphor of a welcome table. And I just want to remind everybody here that in South Africa we have got a challenge in the sense that access to the welcome table in our context has got to be viewed within the framework of the paradox of the articulated yearning to belong as ourselves. And this articulated yearning finds expression in disciplines such as African philosophy, African theology, African ethics, psychology, arts, as well as the ongoing discourse around the imperative to decolonize the entire scientific paradigm. That's one. And this articulated yearning has got to coexist with the enacted existential economic realities, which are largely perceived by some as the proceeds of a evil Western scientific worldview, whilst some see that the proceeds of that worldview as a liberating reality which they need. Both of these come through education. Both of these lines require that access to the welcome table. What's your view on that?
What's my
View.
My view, I agree with you. I was thinking about, you know, for so many years throughout the 20th century, so many decades throughout the 20th century, we just assumed that science was objective. And I think probably on August 6th, 1942 or 45, we learned that it was not objective at all. It was subject to the same subjectivity that other disciplinary inquiry is when the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And I think maybe in this postmodern era, we've learned to be a bit skeptical of that objectivity, that scientific paradigm that you talk about. But in my country, there's this STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics hegemonic force that I, as a humanist, am troubled by. And I hope it's just that we're in one of those troughs in the humanities, periodic troughs that occur and have occurred throughout time, and that maybe after a decade of this STEM influence, people will wake up and say, I really need to study philosophy because I need to study philosophy. The world needs me to study philosophy. So I agree with you. I don't know that I have anything profound as your question to add, but I certainly agree with you. It does take both.
Thank you. We've got that. Sister there? Yeah. Wonderful.
Professor, thank you for being with us. I'll start by saying that. I don't really have a question. Okay, maybe at the end. I don't know if you're going to have an answer to it, but I have something to say. I think education is like an app on a phone. Sometimes you need to go to a store to learn how to use an app on a phone. Same like education. We need to have more people teaching or encouraging the youth, in fact, to learn. Not education, to go and learn. Because you can sit at the learning table. In fact, I like that, having a seat at the learning table, not education. Education would always be there, that's what I think. I think there's a lot more that we still need to instill in the young minds. Like free education, it's becoming more accessible now, but still, learning is still such a huge problem, especially in our country. I think we need to instill that in the young minds. I just always have a question of how. How do we do that? Thank you.
I have an idea. Thank you for your statement. I think at least there are at least two responses to your question. I myself have had professors who taught me who seemed to be standing on the sage, as the sage on the stage, impatiently tapping their foot, waiting for Chad Berry to advance from way over there up to this person's way of thinking. come on, man, get it as soon as you can and come on up to where I am, and then we can carry on. I've also had people, transformative educators who care about the classroom as a sacred space, the way Bell Hooks writes, who went out where I was, understood me for where I was and who I was, and reached out where I was and took me by the arm and said, come along with me, we'll do this together. And I think the latter is so much more effective, because you know what? I think when faculty reach out to students in that way, I think teachers become learners and learners become teachers, and that's a powerful thing when it happens. Thank you.
The last one is Jenny. Thank you.
I just want to pick up on quite a lot of the themes that have come up, I think, from Feroz, particularly where it started, but also this thing of head and heart and hands. For me, our students have been leading the way. The Fees Must Fall protests, with all the complexity that they had, did show us the action that actually has given students free access to higher education. But it has gone further than that, and I think we're ignoring very much that heart and hand stuff that is happening, because it's been the students who have made space for kids coming from farms who come to town. They know that they've got a place in free higher education, they've got nowhere to stay, they don't know how to do it, but the students have found a way to just move between the institutions' kind of regulations to actually hold the other kids. And it's kind of the conversations that we need to recognize and learn from more to see how we overcome the alienation from each other to participate together to make this higher education work. So instead of us pointing the fingers of the overworked staff, because we've got our classes are too big, how do we deal with it? We're not kind of going down to the roots enough and saying, what have we got to offer each other? And how do we work together? So it's a little bit like, how do we socialize the entire resources that are residing within an institution of higher education, instead of kind of individualizing it both as a problem and as a cost? Yeah.
Thank you. I think I should have added to your question who asked me about the head, heart, and hand. The holistic educational goals of head, heart, and hand are a Native American value, that if you go into many Native American communities and you ask people about education, they bristle when people just talk about brain learning, because they have a much more holistic conception of learning than is typical at the university, at least in the United States. And so I do think our institution does seeks not just to see a head as an open vessel and you fill it up with knowledge. That's not the kind of educational philosophy that I subscribe to, but rather brain as a muscle that needs developing the way one develops the heart muscle. But I think it's the hand notion of everyone working on campus 10 or 12 or 20 hours a week, whether that is cleaning up litter on the quadrangle, cleaning toilets in a residence hall, at least initially, or working in the cafeteria, but then moving up as you choose your academic major and working in that academic major. So if you choose to be an accounting major, you're working in the financial affairs office, helping to generate process check requests or what have you, so that when you do sit across the interview table and a person asks you what you've done for 4 years, you have that hand learning to show for it. We even give students not just an academic transcript, we give them a work transcript that has every one of their positions on campus and their performance evaluation. So we do strive for that head, heart, and hand approach, because I think it helps students make that transition to the bridge out more seamlessly.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much. Now we have an opportunity just to briefly listen to Mr. Zenzele Dube, John Dube's grandson, speaking to us on behalf of the family. Yeah, come forward, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Sanibonani. Igama lami nguZenzele Mfundo Dube. Bangako mfundo abala. Because leli gama leli ngiyabona selandile, especially in the townships. Nakubantu abamnyama nje. La UKZN, I'm sure babili bathathu omfundo abalingana nami. Kuhle ngoba sebekhona ke manje ngoba lelo gama igama elibaluleke kabi. Noma mina ke ngazange ngikwazi ukuthola ithuba lokuthi ngilisebenzise effectively. Because ngasuke ngasheshe ngadliwa ihlathi ngisemncane. Ngiyayixolisela ke kuloko. Ngizocela nje ukuthi ngikhulume ngesiZulu. Ngoba isingisi ngathi sisikhuluma kakhulu. Sisithanda kakhulu isiZulu. Uzothola umuntu evakashele ugogo emafamu ehamba nezingane zakhe ezincane. Zifika laphana akukhulunywa nogogo ovakashelwe. Wonke umuntu uhleli ukhuluma na cellphone yakhe. Ingane encane ibhizi lokhu idonsa uma wayo. Ithi hey, granny is smelly. Zenza lezo zinto ingane zenu. Ngizokhuluma ngezinto ezintathu nje. Ngizokhuluma ngezinto ezintathu. Ngizokhuluma ngelanguage, ngikhulume ngefamily, ngikhulume ngeland. Izinto ifamily engithume zona as a message. Kodwa ngizoba very brief. Ngiyacela bafowethu, especially the young people. Ngicela nje ukuthi kenilithanda ulimi lenu. Ungathi mengabe usekhaya noma useflatini. Uqhuma isingisi nje, qhuma isingisi. Isingisi you will Because uyazi ukuthi leyo nto izolidela kuphi. Kukhona abantu who are on standby. Abalinde ukuthi le generation yethu mhlambe slightly nalesilandelayo ukuthi ishone. Ngoba bayithanda lelizwe leli, lihle. Manje kuzosala nina. You are the future leaders. Laba abantu engikhuluma ngaba aba on standby. Bazonibiza badoza la. Akubuza ukuthi ubani igama lakho, esho ngesiZulu. Yena ebengabhilonga esizulwini. Umphendule ngesingisi. Awukubambileke lapho. Angazi ukuthi nizoyaphhi ke ngoba amahlathi awasekho. La thina saqeqeshwa khona. Ngoba bayayithela induku labantu abadlali, bazoyithela kunina, balithathe lelizwe. Liphinde libuyele lapha la liphuma khona. Nazo nje ifiye yami ngendlela enibehave ngakhona. Banibuka nje ba on standby balinde ukuthi sihambe thina. Bazoyithela induku angazi ukuthi nizoya kuliphi ihlathi. Honestly, I'm very very sorry. Ake niyilungise leyo nto leyo. Nanokuthi ake ni prepare. Yini lento yeni yokuthi nithi inibona ukuthi i wrong lento ye teenage pregnancy kodwa nithule nje ningasho lutho. Ingane yesikole encane eno 14 ifake i-school uniform. Iqhubisiso singaka. Ngoba nini efaya ngabe niyisukumela. Nisukumele lo government wenu ovuma lezo zinto. So ake niyiprepareni. Vele fanele ukuthi nibe nawo ama families. Kodwa unfortunately aniyazi i-definition ye family ukuthi yini. Because most of you guys, you young people, you come from single parented families. and you call that a family. That is not a family. Because kune soprano lapha ni bass ayikho. Uyabona lenzo? Yizo ke lezi zinto ezidala ukuthi kube wrong kangaka la eSouth Africa. Ku wrong. Ziningi izinto ezifuna ukufunda. Kukhona lemfundiso ekufanele ukuthi uma ufika esikoleni ufike vele uyiphethe ngoba imfundiso ephuma efamilini. Imfundiso nje discipline. Nokuthobela umthetho. Thina siphuma emafamilini aye nomthetho. La kube ama cellphone ayisekhona ngalezi ayikhathi zethu sikhula singangani. La ubaba wala ekhaya uzothi nje ake sithathe i-hour ifamily yonke izohlala la. Sithathe ama cellphone siwavale sonke ke sikhulume nje ngesizulu sithi discuss about matters that are affecting us. Manje anikwenzi lokho nina. Ufika endlini ufika uyigubuzele ngengubo cofa usho uhambe emgwaqweni ucofa ifone angazi ukuthi yini kangaka. So yiloko ke ngithunywe ukuthi ngikusho regarding ilanguage. Bese ngiza kwi-issue ye family. If family that is the first structure, if family. That is the first structure. Bese kulandela i-community. And then a group of communities, and then they form e-society. And then e-society, ibisi produce a city. And then the city will then basically a country. A country, and then is the continent. Mangobeka leyo nto le ekhanda uzo understand ukuthi ifamily ibaluleke kangakanani. Because that is the first structure. So ake sibambe lapho nje. So ningasheshe njahe ukuthi ube ifamily usase no 14. Ake uziprepare nje. Umuntu ozwana naye. Fanele ukuthi nihlale phansi nixoxe ni arrange ifuture yenu ukuthi yabona mina nawe. So ke sushaye nje mhlambe noma sobona nje mase sidlule ngale ko 25 30 kuyela ko 30. Bese siyabona ukuziprepare lokho. Uyabona? Not ukuthi nje uvela uhlomeke nje. Uyabona lonto? So ke asibuye ke size la kwi-issue ye land. I-issue ye land i-issue la eSouth Africa njengamanje. A very very hot issue. So because inina eniyoung inina enizosala nawo lo mhlaba lo. Ngoba zonke lezi zinto eziqaliwe zizobe ngisingakalungi. Thina soze sihambe la emhlabeni singakalungi lezi zinto ze land. So le problem izosala nani? So I am saying ukuthi ngicela ukuthi you must cease to listen to people abanconfusayo. Because issue ye land ifuna ukuthi approach very very wisely. Ungalaleli nje umuntu ozofika akutshela ukuthi no uhamba uthatha lo mhlaba ngenkani. Ayisebenzi leyo nto. That is not a solution. Ayisebenzi leyo nto. So all I want to say to you, because the issue is very very serious. Ayiqalanga manje, yaqala ngabo John Dube ukuba very serious issue ye land. Namanje isase important. So I'm saying ukuthi mani deal nale issue. Musana uconfuse abantu nibatshela ukuthi abahambe bodla umhlaba nje, you know. Ayona solution leyo. That is going to create even more problems. So ke ngicela ukuthi nibe very very sober man deal nama issues eland. Nihlale phansi ni discuss nibone ukuthi no this is what is going to work. This is not going to work. Yiloko nje bengithunywe ukuthi ngikulethe kunina ngiyabonga.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mbuyazi. Thank you for your bravery and addressing really pertinent issues. We are now going to have Dr. Masondo coming forward to express a vote of thanks to people for coming and participating in this lecture. You can come forward, sir. Yeah.
Sanibona. Thana ngizokhuluma ngesiZulu nje. I would like to thank all of you for coming today. It's really an honor to have such a big crowd of people attending this very important lecture. It's a pity that we are not more than this number, because the kinds of issues that were discussed today are very critical to higher education in South Africa, especially our university. Our executives would have benefited quite a bit from this. I hope, Carol, you still have a job. We are going to tell your dean that he made a mistake by asking you to respond to this lecture. But people, thank you very much for coming. Would like to thank everybody who contributed. Would like to thank the committee that organized. They know themselves. They did a wonderful job once again. Thank you very much. You can pat yourselves in the back. We also like to thank those who contributed financially to this event. The deans of the two schools, the Dean of Research in the College of Humanities, the Deputy Vice Chancellor in the College of Humanities, the J.L. Dube Institute. They also contributed a bit. So we would like to thank all of those people. But more especially, we would like to thank Professor Berry for coming all the way from Kentucky. Come on, people, come on, people. Are you that hungry? To come all the way and share his experiences with us. It was valuable for us as a people who are building a country, people who are building an institution. Thank you so much for coming, Professor Berry. We really, really appreciate what you've done, and we really appreciate your presence in our midst. The committee has put together this token of our appreciation. It's nothing much, but we felt that it's something that you would look at and think of us wherever you will be. Thank you very much. Would you please come forward so that we can have a photo opportunity? Prof? You can come over, Prof. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
For the photo opportunity.
For the photo opportunity. Thank you so much. Thank you. Siyabonga ke bagwethu. Then we are going to, it's the tradition of this lecture that we sing the national anthem, and then once we are done, the back, and the team that has been preparing for the lecture, either they come forward for the photo. The team, they can come forward for that.